Evelyn sat in her small, sunlit living room, her eyes locked on the grand piano that now dominated the space. The piano, an antique Steinway passed down from her late mother, stood as a relic of another era, its polished mahogany frame gleaming in the muted light. To the world outside, it might have seemed like a treasure, a rare and valuable piece of history, but to Evelyn, it was a Pandora's box of memories she had no desire to open. The keys, yellowed with time, seemed to silently mock her, daring her to play, to awaken the ghost that had slept within for decades. She had avoided it for years, ever since she left her childhood home behind, ever since she swore she would never look back. Yet here it was, delivered to her doorstep, a final gift from her mother's estate, a silent and undeniable connection to the past she had worked so hard to forget. As she stood there, frozen in contemplation, Evelyn felt the weight of her history pressing down on her like an old, heavy quilt. The piano wasn't just an instrument. It was the centerpiece of her childhood, a fixture of her family's modest home. Her mother, Clara, had been a gifted pianist, her hands dancing effortlessly over the keys, weaving melodies that filled their small house with warmth. Evelyn could still remember how the sound carried through the creaky wooden floors and thin walls, creating a cocoon of music that seemed to shield them from the harsh realities of life. But the music wasn't always joyful. There were times when it shifted into something darker, something melancholic, as if her mother were pouring all her unspoken pain into the notes. And there was plenty of pain to be felt. Evelyn was only 8 years old when her father, Charles, vanished without a word. One day he was there, laughing and singing along to Clara's tunes, and the next he was gone. No explanations, no goodbyes, just an empty chair at the dinner table and a hole in their lives that nothing could fill. Clara never spoke of him again, and Evelyn quickly learned not to ask. Instead, her mother turned to the piano, her music transforming into a language of grief and longing that no one else seemed to understand. Evelyn and her younger brother, Theo, would sit quietly in a corner, watching as Clara played, their small faces etched with confusion and fear. They didn't understand the words their mother wasn't saying, but they felt them deeply in the haunting crescendos and lingering notes that filled their home. The piano became a symbol of both comfort and sorrow, a duality that followed Evelyn into adulthood. When she left her hometown at 18, determined to start fresh and escape the shadows of her past, she left the piano behind, convinced she would never see it again. She moved to the city, married, and built a life for herself that had no room for old ghosts or unanswered questions. But life has a way of circling back, of bringing the things we run from right to our doorstep, and now decades later, the piano had found its way back to her. It arrived unexpectedly, a surprise bequeathment from her mother's will, and with it came a flood of emotions Evelyn wasn't prepared for. She hadn't played a single note since she was a teenager, since the day she found herself at the bench, trying to replicate her mother's melodies and failing miserably. That failure, coupled with the weight of her father's disappearance, had been enough to make her swear off music altogether. But now, as the piano sat in her living room, it seemed to radiate a quiet insistence, as if it were calling her, beckoning her to confront what she had left behind. Her grandson, Liam, had been enchanted by the piano from the moment it arrived. At 16, he was curious, imaginative, and full of questions about the instrument's history. "Play something, Grandma," he would say, his eyes wide with anticipation. But Evelyn always shook her head, offering excuses about its delicate condition or her rusty skills. The truth was, she wasn't ready to hear the piano's voice again. She wasn't ready for what it might reveal. Yet, even as she avoided it, the piano seemed to grow more alive. Its presence was impossible to ignore, its polished surface reflecting the light in ways that made it seem almost ethereal. On some nights, Evelyn would catch herself staring at it, her hands twitching with a ghost of muscle memory, as if her body remembered what her mind had long buried. She could almost hear her mother's melodies in the quiet of the house, faint echoes that stirred something deep within her. The memories were relentless, flooding back with a force that left Evelyn breathless. She saw her father's smile, her mother's hands on the keys, Theo's laughter as he banged out childish tunes. But beneath those happy memories lay the unresolved questions, the pain of abandonment, and the silence that had filled their home after her father disappeared. Why had he left? Where had he gone? And why had her mother never told her the truth? The piano, it seemed, held the answers. It had been a silent witness to everything: her father's departure, her mother's grief, her own struggles to make sense of it all. And now it was here, in her home, demanding her attention, urging her to uncover the stories it held. Evelyn wasn't sure she was ready, but deep down, she knew that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. The first time Evelyn heard the piano play on its own, she thought she was imagining it. It was late at night, the kind of quiet that felt almost oppressive, where every creak of the house sounded louder than it should. She was in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep as her mind churned over the oddities of the past few days. The arrival of the piano had unearthed memories she thought were long buried, and now they wouldn't leave her alone. She had resisted sitting at the bench, resisted even so much as brushing her fingers over the keys. She told herself it was because she was too old to start playing again, that her hands were stiff, her memory unreliable. But deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't the playing she feared. It was the piano itself. Then, as she lay there, she heard it. A single soft note drifted through the house, clear and deliberate, like the whisper of someone calling her name. She sat up abruptly, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she thought it was Liam, perhaps sneaking out of bed to tinker with a forbidden instrument. But the sound wasn't random, like a child pressing keys at random. It was purposeful, a melody she hadn't heard in decades. It was her mother's melody, a lullaby Clara had often played on sleepless nights to calm both herself and her children. Evelyn swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor as she moved cautiously toward the living room. The house felt different somehow, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for her. The melody continued, soft and haunting, as if the piano were playing itself with a kind of aching reverence. Evelyn's breath caught as she rounded the corner and saw the instrument illuminated by the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the window. The lid was closed, the bench untouched, and yet the music filled the air, impossibly real. For a long moment, she simply stood there, frozen in place, unsure whether to approach or run. Her mind raced through logical explanations. Maybe it was the wind, or a mechanical issue, or perhaps Liam had left a recording playing. But as she stepped closer, the explanations crumbled. The music wasn't coming from a speaker or a hidden device. It was emanating directly from the piano. It sounded rich and full, vibrating through the room like a heartbeat. "Impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. But the piano didn't care about what was possible. It continued its ghostly serenade, each note resonating with a familiarity that sent shivers down her spine. The melody wasn't just music. It was a memory, a fragment of her childhood that had been locked away for years. It was the song her mother used to play on sleepless nights, the one that always made Evelyn feel safe, even when the world felt like it was falling apart. As she stood there, a wave of emotions washed over her: fear, confusion, nostalgia, and something else she couldn't quite name. It was as if the piano were trying to speak to her, to tell her something she didn't yet understand. She reached out tentatively, her fingers hovering just above the keys, and as if in response, the music stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, leaving her standing in the darkened room, her hand trembling in the air. "Liam," she called out, her voice shaky. There was no answer. She turned on the lights, half expecting to find her grandson hiding nearby, but the room was empty. The piano sat there, silent and unassuming, as if daring her to accuse it of something impossible. Evelyn let out a shaky breath, her mind reeling. She was too old for ghost stories, too practical to believe in the supernatural. And yet, what she had just experienced defied all reason. She spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, her eyes fixed on the piano, waiting for it to do something, anything, to prove she wasn't losing her mind. But it remained quiet, its polished surface reflecting the soft glow of the lamp she had turned on. By morning, she had almost convinced herself it had been a dream, a trick of her overtired brain. Almost. The next evening, it happened again. This time she wasn't in bed. She was in the kitchen washing dishes after dinner, while Liam sat in the other room playing a game on his tablet. The first note startled her so much she dropped a glass into the sink, the sound of it shattering barely registering as she turned toward the living room. The melody was the same as before, soft and deliberate, weaving its way through the house like a gentle breeze. "Liam," she called louder this time. Her grandson appeared in the doorway, his face a mix of concern and curiosity. "Did you touch the piano?" she demanded. "No, Grandma," he said, shaking his head. "I haven't touched it at all. I promise." The sincerity in his voice only deepened her unease. She walked into the living room, Liam trailing behind her, and the two of them stood side by side, staring at the piano as it played itself. "Grandma, how is it doing that?" Liam whispered, his voice tinged with a rather than fear. "I don't know," Evelyn admitted, her own voice barely steady. She reached out again, her hand trembling as it hovered over the keys. This time the music didn't stop. Instead, it grew louder, the notes swelling with a kind of urgency that made her heart race. She pressed down on one of the keys, and the sound stopped abruptly, as if she had interrupted something sacred. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Liam, ever the inquisitive teenager, said, "Do you think it haunted?" Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't know what to think. All she knew was that the piano wasn't just an object anymore. It was alive in some way, and it was trying to tell her something. The morning after the second incident, Evelyn found herself sitting at the piano, staring at it as though it were an unfamiliar stranger in her home. It hadn't made another sound since the previous evening, but its presence felt heavier now, almost oppressive, as though it were silently demanding her attention. The events of the last 2 nights played over and over in her mind, each note of the haunting melody lingering in her thoughts. She had spent hours searching for a rational explanation, faulty mechanics, a draft in the house, perhaps even a prank played by Liam that he was too clever to admit. Yet none of it made sense. She hadn't touched this piano in decades, and as far as she knew, neither had anyone else. That afternoon, with Liam at school and the house quiet, Evelyn finally mustered the courage to sit at the bench. The familiar creak of the wood beneath her weight sent a shiver through her, and she hesitated, her hands resting in her lap. Her reflection stared back at her in the piano's glossy surface, a reminder of how much time had passed since the last time she had sat here. She didn't recognize the older woman in the reflection, her lined face and gray hair so different from the girl who used to watch her mother play. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn lifted the fallboard, exposing the yellowed keys. They seemed to stare back at her, daring her to press them. But as her fingers hovered over the middle C, her gaze shifted to the ornate carvings along the piano's front panel. She had always thought they were purely decorative, intricate patterns that gave the piano its timeless elegance. Now, though, she noticed something she had never seen before, tiny, almost imperceptible notches along the edge of one of the panels. Curiosity outweighed her trepidation, and Evelyn leaned in, running her fingers along the grooves. They weren't random. They formed a subtle pattern, like an indentation meant to be opened. Her breath quickened as she pressed on the panel, and to her astonishment, it clicked and shifted slightly, revealing a hidden compartment built into the piano. She pulled it open slowly, half expecting dust and cobwebs, but what she found took her breath away. Inside the compartment was a stack of old yellowed sheet music, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was brittle to the touch, the edges worn and frayed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was her father's. Evelyn's hands trembled as she untied the ribbon and unfolded the top sheet. Her father's neat script filled the page, the notes carefully penned as though each one carried a piece of his soul. At the bottom, in the corner, was his signature, Charles H. Abernathy. For a moment, Evelyn couldn't breathe. Her father had been gone for so long, his presence in her life reduced to fading memories and unanswered questions. And yet, here was a piece of him, hidden in the piano her mother had played all those years. Why had Clara kept this from her? Why hadn't she ever mentioned it? Evelyn's mind raced with questions, each one louder than the last. The melody on the sheet was unfamiliar, its structure complex and almost cryptic. Evelyn couldn't tell if it was a complete composition or something unfinished, but it seemed deliberate, intentional, as though it were meant for someone specific. She flipped through the other sheets, finding more handwritten compositions, some with annotations in her father's hand, others with markings that seemed to be her mother's. The two of them, collaborating in some silent dialogue across the years, across a divide that had never been bridged. Evelyn's heart ached as she tried to make sense of it all. Her father had been a man of many talents, but music wasn't one she associated with him. He had always been the pragmatic one, the steady presence in their lives, until the day he disappeared. What had driven him to write these compositions? And why had her mother hidden them in the piano? As she studied the sheets, a memory surfaced, unbidden and vivid. She was 8 years old, sitting on the floor of the living room while her father and mother argued in the next room. She couldn't hear all the words, but she remembered her father's voice, low and insistent, and her mother's high-pitched and strained. Later that night, her mother had sat at the piano and played a song Evelyn had never heard before, a mournful, aching melody that made her cry without understanding why. It was the same melody that had played on its own 2 nights ago. The realization sent a chill down her spine. The piano wasn't just an instrument. It was a vessel, a bridge between her parents' unspoken truths and her own unanswered questions. It had been silent for so long, waiting for her to find this, to uncover the secrets it held. Evelyn felt an overwhelming urge to play the music, to hear it with her own hands, but she hesitated. What if it brought more questions than answers? What if it revealed truths she wasn't ready to face? By the time Liam returned home from school, Evelyn was still sitting at the piano. The sheet music spread out before her like a map to a forgotten past. "What's that?" he asked, peering over her shoulder. "Your great-grandfather's music," Evelyn said softly, her voice tinged with awe and disbelief. Liam's eyes widened. "I didn't know he played the piano." "Neither did I," Evelyn admitted, her voice trembling. She handed him one of the sheets, and he studied it with a curiosity only a teenager could muster. "This is so cool," he said. "You should play it, Grandma." Evelyn shook her head. "I don't know if I can." "Of course you can," Liam said, his tone encouraging. "You always say you used to play when you were a kid. It's like riding a bike, right?" But Evelyn wasn't so sure. Playing this music felt like opening a door she couldn't close, a door that led to places she wasn't sure she wanted to go. Yet the piano seemed to call to her, its silent presence filling the room with an almost palpable anticipation. Evelyn looked at Liam, his young face so full of hope and excitement that she felt a flicker of courage. "Maybe later," she said, folding the sheet music carefully and placing it back in the compartment. It's not the right time, but she knew the time would come. The piano wouldn't let her ignore it forever. That night, the house seemed heavier with an air of anticipation. Evelyn lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. The discovery of her father's handwritten compositions had shifted something inside her. The sheets of music were more than just relics. They were messages, deliberately hidden, meant to be found. But what were they trying to say? And why now, after all these years? As she lay there, her mind spinning, the silence of the house was broken once again by the unmistakable sound of the piano. This time, the notes were not soft and tentative. They were insistent, building into a melody that made Evelyn's heart pound in her chest. She sat up, her breath caught in her throat. The melody was hauntingly familiar yet alien, as if it were pulling fragments of her childhood and weaving them into something new. She wrapped her robe tightly around herself and stepped into the hallway, her footsteps cautious and deliberate. The music filled the house, louder now, as though the piano were alive, pouring its soul into the air. Evelyn reached the living room and froze. The piano's lid was closed, the bench empty, yet the music played on, the keys moving of their own accord. Evelyn's first instinct was to run. Every rational fiber in her being told her to leave the room, to lock the door and pretend this wasn't happening. But something held her there, curiosity, perhaps, or the nagging feeling that this was meant for her. She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the piano, and as she approached, the melody shifted. It slowed, softened, and then stopped, as if acknowledging her presence. "Why are you doing this?" Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. Of course, there was no answer, but the air felt charged, as though the piano itself were alive, listening, waiting for her to act. Against her better judgment, she reached out and placed her hand on the lid. It was warm to the touch, as if it had absorbed the heat of the music it had just played. Slowly, she lifted the lid, exposing the keys. As her fingers hovered above them, the room seemed to change. The air grew thicker, the shadows deeper, and Evelyn felt a strange sensation, like a current of energy coursing through her. Her fingers moved instinctively, pressing the keys in a sequence she didn't recognize but somehow knew. The notes she played were not random. They formed a melody that resonated deep within her, as though it had been waiting inside her all along. The room around her began to shimmer, the edges of her vision blurring as the music grew louder, more insistent. Then suddenly, she wasn't in her living room anymore. She was back in her childhood home, sitting at the piano while her mother played beside her. The room was warm, filled with the golden light of a summer evening, and Evelyn could smell the faint scent of lavender that always clung to her mother's dresses. She looked down at her hands and saw that they were small, the hands of a child. "Play with me, Evelyn," her mother said, her voice soft and familiar. Evelyn turned to her, tears welling in her eyes. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking. But her mother didn't seem to hear her. She continued playing, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys, creating a melody that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Evelyn tried to speak again, to ask her mother what was happening, but her voice wouldn't come. She was trapped in the memory, a spectator in her own life, watching as her mother poured her soul into the music. Then, as suddenly as it began, the vision faded. Evelyn was back in her living room, her hands trembling on the keys. The piano was silent, the air heavy with the weight of what she had just experienced. She sat there for a long time, her mind reeling. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? Or had the piano somehow transported her into the past? The sound of footsteps broke her reverie, and she turned to see Liam standing in the doorway, his face pale and wide-eyed. "Grandma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw it too." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "Saw what?" "The light," Liam said, stepping into the room. "It was like the piano was glowing. And I heard the music." "It wasn't just you playing, was it?" Evelyn shook her head, unsure of how to explain what had happened. "I don't know what it was," she admitted. "But it wasn't just me." Liam sat down beside her on the bench, his eyes fixed on the piano. "Do you think it's a ghost?" "I don't know," Evelyn said again, her voice unsteady. "But whatever it is, it's trying to tell us something." Liam looked at her, his youthful curiosity tempered by a hint of fear. "What if it's Grandpa?" he asked quietly. The question sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. She had spent her entire life wondering what had happened to her father, why he had left, and whether he had ever thought of her again. The idea that he might be reaching out to her now, through this piano, was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I don't know," she said softly, "but I think we have to find out." Liam nodded, his fear giving way to determination. "Then let's play the music," he said. "Let's see what happens." Evelyn hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached for the stack of sheet music still tucked inside the piano's hidden compartment. She pulled out the top sheet, her father's handwriting staring back at her like a challenge. The melody was complex, the notes forming intricate patterns that seemed almost like a code. Evelyn placed the sheet on the stand and looked at Liam. "Stay close," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied. With a deep breath, Evelyn placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The room filled with music, the notes resonating with an almost tangible energy. As the melody unfolded, the air grew thick again, and Evelyn felt the same strange sensation she had before, a pull, as if the music were opening a door to something beyond her understanding. And then the room shimmered once more, and the past came rushing back. As Evelyn's fingers glided over the keys, a rush of memories and sensations filled the room, as if the music itself were alive, bending time and space. The melody grew richer, fuller, its notes intertwining with an energy that was both overwhelming and strangely comforting. Liam sat beside her, his wide eyes darting between the piano and his grandmother, his youthful curiosity holding him captive. Then, just as the final chord resonated and faded into silence, something extraordinary happened. The piano emitted a soft creak, and Evelyn froze as the sound of shifting would echoed in the quiet room. A narrow compartment she hadn't noticed before slid open beneath the music stand, revealing a hidden drawer. Evelyn hesitated, her heart pounding as though the piano itself were holding its breath. She exchanged a glance with Liam, who nodded eagerly. Slowly, she reached into the drawer and pulled out its contents, a collection of old letters, brittle with age, tied together with a faded ribbon. Beneath the letters was a small leather-bound journal, its edges worn and frayed, and a sepia-toned photograph of a young couple standing beside the very same piano. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "That's Grandpa," Liam whispered, pointing to the man in the photograph. "And is that Grandma Clara?" Evelyn nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the image. It was her parents, but not as she had ever known them. They looked young and carefree, their faces glowing with a happiness she had never associated with their marriage. The photograph was dated in the corner, 1949, the year before Evelyn was born. She stared at the picture, her mind racing with questions. What was this doing here? Why had her mother hidden it? "Open the letters," Liam urged, his voice breaking through her thoughts. Evelyn untied the ribbon with trembling fingers and unfolded the first letter. It was addressed to her mother in her father's handwriting. As she read the opening lines, her chest tightened. The letter was a love note, filled with tender words that painted a picture of a man deeply in love with his wife. But as she continued, the tone shifted. Charles wrote of regret, of secrets he had kept, and of choices he had made that might one day come back to haunt them. Evelyn read aloud, her voice trembling. "Clara, my love, there are things I wish I could tell you, things I have done to protect you and the children. But some truths are too dangerous, too heavy to bear. If you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to keep them hidden. Forgive me, and remember that everything I did was for you and Evelyn and Theo. You are my world." The letter ended abruptly, as though her father had been interrupted while writing it. Evelyn stared at the paper, her mind struggling to process the words. What secrets was he talking about? What had he done? She looked at Liam, who was just as bewildered. "Do you think he was in trouble?" he asked. "I don't know," Evelyn said quietly. But this doesn't make sense. My father was a banker. He was steady, predictable. He wasn't the kind of man who kept dangerous secrets. Maybe that's what he wanted you to think, Liam suggested, his voice tinged with the excitement of a boy unraveling a mystery. Evelyn reached for the next letter, but Liam's sharp intake of breath stopped her. She followed his gaze to the journal, which had fallen open to reveal pages filled with hurried, almost frantic handwriting. The entries were dated, each one chronicling a period of time leading up to her father's disappearance. The first few entries were mundane, detailing everyday life, his work, their home, the joy of watching Evelyn and Theo grow. But as the entries progressed, they grew darker, more cryptic. Her father wrote of strange encounters, of people asking questions about his past, and of his growing fear that he was being watched. One entry stood out. The piano will keep them safe. Clara doesn't understand, but she will in time. It's the only way to protect them. Evelyn's hand shook as she read the words. Protect them from what? And why the piano? She looked at Liam, who was staring at the journal with a mix of fear and fascination. Grandma, he said slowly, I think this is bigger than we thought. Evelyn nodded, her mind spinning. The piano, the letters, the journal, it all pointed to something she had never imagined about her father. He hadn't simply walked out on their family. He had been protecting them from something he had deemed too dangerous to share. We need to read all of it, Evelyn said, her voice firm despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She and Liam spent hours poring over the letters and journal entries, piecing together fragments of a story that was as shocking as it was heartbreaking. Her father, it seemed, had been involved in something far beyond his quiet life as a banker. There were hints of financial dealings gone wrong, of people he had crossed, and of a desperate attempt to shield his family from the fallout. The journal mentioned cryptic warnings about a man who had come to their house one evening, and Evelyn felt a chill as she remembered the fear in her mother's eyes on that long-ago night. But the most startling revelation came from the final entry in the journal. If anything happens to me, the piano will guide them. It knows the truth. Clara will understand when the time comes. Evelyn closed the journal, her hands trembling. The piano knows the truth, she murmured. What does that mean? Liam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Evelyn admitted, her voice heavy with emotion. But if my father believed this piano could somehow protect us, then there's more to this than we've found so far. The room seemed to grow quieter, the piano looming in a corner like a silent sentinel. Evelyn placed her hand on its polished surface, her fingers tracing its familiar curves. For the first time, she didn't see it as just an object. It was a guardian, a vessel for secrets, and perhaps even a lifeline to the father she had lost so long ago. This isn't over, Evelyn said, turning to Liam. We're going to find out the truth, no matter where it leads us. Liam nodded, his face resolute. I'm with you, Grandma. And as they sat together in the quiet of the living room, the piano seemed to hum with a life of its own, as though it were readying itself for the journey ahead. The days that followed were a whirlwind of revelations, but they brought no clarity, only deeper questions that gnawed at Evelyn's mind. The letters and journal entries had painted a picture of her father as a man burdened by choices she could barely comprehend, choices that had ultimately led to his disappearance. But even with the fragments they had pieced together, one question remained unanswered. Why had he left them? Evelyn had spent her entire life believing her father had abandoned them, leaving her mother to raise 2 children alone. The bitterness of that belief had shaped her, hardened her in ways she was only now beginning to understand. But now, with the evidence laid out before her, that narrative was crumbling, leaving her with an ache she couldn't ignore. One evening, Evelyn sat alone at the piano, her fingers resting on the keys without pressing them. Liam had gone to bed, but not before begging her to play the new melody they had uncovered. She had promised him she would, though the truth was she wasn't sure she could. Playing her father's music felt like stepping into his shoes, like taking on a piece of the burden he had carried in silence for so long. And she wasn't sure she was ready for that. The house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock on a mantelpiece. The letters and journals sat on the piano bench beside her, their words echoing in her mind. One line in particular stood out: "Everything I did for them." She had read it over and over, trying to make sense of it. Was it true? Had her father truly left to protect them, or was that just a justification for choices he regretted? The ambiguity of it all felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. Evelyn's thoughts drifted to her mother, to the way Clara had carried on after Charles disappeared. She had been a pillar of strength, raising Evelyn and Theo with unwavering determination, but there had always been a shadow behind her smile, a sadness she never explained. Had she known the truth about Charles? Had she forgiven him? And if she had, why hadn't she told Evelyn? As these questions swirled in her mind, Evelyn pressed a single key, the note hanging in the air like a question waiting to be answered. The sound sent a shiver through her, and she couldn't help but feel that the piano was listening, waiting for her to make the next move. She pressed another key, then another, and soon she was playing the melody her father had written. The notes flowed from her fingers with surprising ease, as if they had been waiting inside her all along. The music was haunting and beautiful, a tapestry of emotions that seemed to tell a story without words. As she played, memories of her childhood surfaced, her father lifting her onto his shoulders, her mother's laughter ringing through the house, the warmth of their family before it all fell apart. The music seemed to pull at these memories, weaving them into something bittersweet and undeniable. By the time the last note faded, Evelyn was crying. Not just tears of sadness, but of anger, confusion, and longing. She felt as though she were mourning not just her father, but the life they could have had if he had stayed. But beneath the pain, there was something else, a faint glimmer of understanding. For the first time, Evelyn allowed herself to consider the possibility that her father hadn't left because he didn't love them, but because he did. The thought was both comforting and agonizing, a contradiction she couldn't reconcile. If he had truly left to protect them, then why had he stayed silent? Why hadn't he come back once the danger had passed? The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned to see Liam standing in the doorway, his face soft with concern. "Grandma," he said, his voice quiet. "Are you okay?" Evelyn wiped her eyes quickly, giving him a weak smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking." Liam walked over and sat beside her on the bench, his presence grounding her. "You played it," he said, nodding toward the piano. "How did it feel?" Evelyn hesitated, searching for the right words. "It felt like he was here," she said finally. "Like he was trying to tell me something." Liam nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think he wanted you to forgive him?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Evelyn had spent decades resenting her father, blaming him for the pain his absence had caused. Forgiving him felt like betraying the life her mother had built without him, the sacrifices she had made to keep their family afloat. But holding on to that resentment felt equally unbearable now, knowing what she knew, or thought she knew, about his reasons for leaving. "I don't know if I can," Evelyn admitted, her voice breaking. "I want to, but it's not that simple." Liam placed a hand on hers, his youthful wisdom catching her off guard. "Maybe it doesn't have to be all or nothing," he said. "Maybe you can forgive him for the parts he got right, even if you're still mad about the rest." Evelyn stared at him, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. "You're a smart kid, you know that," she said, squeezing his hand. Liam grinned. "I have a pretty smart grandma." They sat in silence for a while, the piano standing between them like a bridge to the past. Evelyn knew she wasn't ready to forgive her father entirely, but for the first time, She felt the possibility of letting go of some of the anger she had carried for so long. "I think it's time we found out the rest of the story," she said finally, her voice steady. Liam nodded. "What do we do next?" Evelyn looked at the piano, its polished surface gleaming in the lamplight. "We keep playing," she said, "and we see where it takes us." And as she placed her hands on the keys once more, Evelyn felt a sense of resolve she hadn't felt in years. The answers were out there, hidden in the music, the letters, and the memories she had buried. It was time to face them, no matter what truths they revealed. The days passed like pages turning in a book Evelyn hadn't intended to read but now couldn't put down. Each time she sat at the piano, she felt a deeper connection to the music, as if her father's compositions were speaking to her, filling in the gaps of a story she had long ago stopped trying to understand. Liam was her constant companion in this journey, his youthful energy and unflagging curiosity propelling them both forward. Together, they deciphered more of the letters, uncovered additional journal entries, and unearthed a narrative that was as heartbreaking as it was beautiful, a tale of love, sacrifice, and secrets too heavy for one man to carry alone. One morning, as they sat at the kitchen table with the letters spread out between them, Liam looked up and said, "You know what you should do, Grandma? You should play one of these songs for other people. Like, really play it. Share it." Evelyn stared at him, caught off guard. "What do you mean? Like a performance?" "Yeah," Liam said, his eyes lighting up. "You're always talking about how music connects people, how it's a way to tell stories. These songs are a part of your family's story. Don't you think other people would want to hear that?" The idea sent a shiver of apprehension through Evelyn. She hadn't played for an audience in decades, not since she was a teenager, fumbling through recitals under her mother's watchful eye. And this wasn't just any music. It was her father's, steeped in the emotions and mysteries she had spent her life avoiding. The thought of bearing that part of herself to others felt almost too vulnerable to contemplate. "I don't know, Liam," she said hesitantly. "It's one thing to play here, just for us. It's another to perform." Liam leaned forward, his expression earnest. "But that's the whole point, isn't it? This music isn't just about you or Grandpa. It's about sharing something bigger than yourself. And you're the only one who can do it." Evelyn looked at him, heart swelling with pride and love. He was right, of course. The music had been hidden for too long, its story locked away in the piano like a secret waiting to be told. And maybe, just maybe, sharing it could help her find the closure she had been searching for. A few days later, Evelyn found herself standing on the small stage of the local community center, her heart pounding as she looked out at the rows of folding chairs filling with friends, neighbors, and curious strangers. The piano had been transported there earlier in the day, and now it stood in the center of the stage, gleaming under the soft glow of the overhead lights. Liam had insisted on sitting in the front row, his enthusiasm a steady anchor in the sea of Evelyn's nerves. The event had been billed as an evening of forgotten music, a title Liam had come up with, and the response had been overwhelming. People were intrigued by the story of the rediscovered compositions, and Evelyn couldn't help but feel a mix of gratitude and anxiety as she watched them file in. Among the audience were a few familiar faces from her past, old friends she hadn't seen in years, people who had known her mother, and even a few who had known her father before he disappeared. As the lights dimmed and the murmurs of the crowd quieted, Evelyn took a deep breath and stepped forward. She hadn't prepared a speech, but the words seemed to find her anyway, rising from a place deep inside her. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "This music you're about to hear was written by my father, Charles Abernathy. Some of you may remember him, and some of you may not. He disappeared when I was a child, and for most of my life, I thought that was the end of his story. But recently, I discovered something remarkable. These compositions, hidden in the piano he left behind. They've helped me see him in a new light, not just as the father who left, but as a man who loved deeply and sacrificed more than I ever realized. Tonight, I'd like to share his music with you, and through it, a piece of his story. The room was silent as Evelyn sat at the piano, the weight of the moment settling over her like a warm blanket. She placed her hands on the keys, her fingers trembling slightly, and began to play. The first notes were tentative, like a bird testing its wings, but as the melody unfolded, Evelyn found her rhythm. The music was haunting and beautiful, filled with emotions too complex for words: love, regret, hope, and something that felt like forgiveness. It carried her back through time, to moments she thought she had forgotten. Her father lifting her onto his shoulders, her mother's hands guiding hers on the keys, the laughter and warmth of a family that had been fractured but not broken. As she played, she felt the room around her fade away, the audience dissolving into the background. It was just her and the piano, the music filling the space between them like a bridge spanning the decades. By the time she reached the final chord, tears were streaming down her face, and she wasn't the only one. The room erupted into applause, the sound washing over her like a wave. Evelyn stood and took a bow, her heart full and light for the first time in years. As she stepped off the stage, Liam was the first to greet her, throwing his arms around her in a hug that was as much for him as it was for her. "You were amazing, Grandma," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That was incredible." Evelyn smiled, her eyes still glistening with tears. "I couldn't have done it without you, Liam. Thank you for believing in me." As the crowd began to disperse, people approached her to share their own memories and stories of her father, each one adding another piece to the puzzle of who he had been. For the first time, Evelyn felt a sense of peace, as though she had finally found the closure she had been searching for. But as she turned back to the piano to gather her things, a faint, familiar melody drifted through the air, a single, soft note followed by another. Evelyn froze, her breath catching in her throat. The piano was playing on its own again, its notes clear and deliberate, as if it were saying, "There's more to the story." The faint melody from the piano hung in the air, silencing the murmurs of the remaining audience members. Evelyn froze mid-step, her heart pounding as the familiar yet haunting notes reverberated through the room. She knew this song. It wasn't one she had played during her performance, but one that had emerged in fragments over the past few weeks, an unfinished melody her father had written. Yet now it was complete, its progression fluid and purposeful, as though the piano itself had taken on a life of its own. Liam rushed to her side, his eyes wide with awe and just a hint of fear. "Grandma, it's happening again," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the music. Evelyn nodded, her throat dry. "I hear it," she murmured. The room had grown eerily still, the remaining guests watching with a mix of curiosity and unease. The piano played on, its notes weaving an intricate melody that seemed to carry an unspoken message. Summoning her courage, Evelyn stepped closer to the piano, the weight of its presence almost tangible. The music grew softer as she approached, as if acknowledging her. Her trembling fingers reached out to touch the keys, but before she could, the final note played, resonating through the room like a whisper of farewell. Then, as if the piano had exhausted its energy, it fell silent, the air around it suddenly still. "Did anyone else see that?" one of the audience members asked, breaking the silence. Evelyn turned, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. Faces filled with wonder, confusion, and even fear stared back at her. She looked at Liam, who gave her an encouraging nod, and then back at the piano. Something told her the moment wasn't over yet. With deliberate care, she reached for the hidden compartment beneath the music stand, the one that had already revealed so many secrets. This time, when she pulled it open, there was something new inside, a single envelope aged and yellowed, but unmistakably fresh to her eyes. Her hands trembled as she retrieved it, the crowd watching in hushed anticipation. The envelope was addressed to her in a handwriting she would have recognized anywhere. Evelyn, it read, her name written in her father's neat, steady script. Tears welled to her eyes as she stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. "Open it," Liam urged, his voice steady despite the tremor of excitement in his words. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, the weight of the past pressing down on her. Then, with a deep breath, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The paper was fragile, its edges frayed, but the words were clear, as if they had been written just yesterday. "My dearest Evelyn," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means you found the music, the letters, and the truth I couldn't tell you when you were a child. I hope by now you understand that everything I did was for you, Theo, and your mother. I left not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. There were people, powerful, dangerous people, who would have hurt you if I had stayed. The piano was my way of ensuring you would one day know the truth. It was our bridge, our connection, even when I couldn't be there." Evelyn's vision blurred as tears streamed down her face. Her father's words were a balm to wound she hadn't realized were still open. He hadn't abandoned her, he had sacrificed himself to protect her. "I hope this music has brought you closer to understanding not just me, but yourself. You carry the strength of your mother and the love of a father who never stopped thinking of you. And if you ever feel lost, remember this: music is our legacy. It connects us, binds us, and carries our stories forward. Play it, share it, let it be the light that guides you." The letter ended simply with his signature, "All my love, Dad." Evelyn clutched the letter to her chest, her tears falling freely. Around her, the room was silent, the weight of the moment settling over everyone like a blanket. Liam placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes glistening. "He loved you, Grandma. He never stopped." Evelyn nodded, her voice trembling as she whispered, "I know that now." But just as she thought the moment had passed, the piano emitted one final soft hum, as though it had something left to say. Evelyn turned back to it, her heart racing. Beneath the envelope in the hidden compartment, she noticed a small key, ornate and delicate, with an inscription etched into the metal, to the place where it all began. "What does it mean?" Liam asked, his voice filled with wonder. Evelyn stared at the key, her mind racing. She knew exactly where it belonged. "It's the key to the house," she said quietly. "The house I grew up in, where the piano was before it came to me." The realization hit her like a wave. The answers weren't just in the letters or the music. They were in the house itself, the place where her family's story had begun and perhaps where it could find its final resolution. Without hesitation, Evelyn turned to Liam. "We're going," she said firmly. "Now?" he asked, his eyes widening. "Yes," Evelyn said, her resolve stronger than ever. "If this piano has taught me anything, it's that some truths can't wait. It's time to finish this." The audience parted as Evelyn and Liam made their way out, the key clutched tightly in her hand. The journey back to her childhood home would be the final chapter of a story that had begun long before she was ready to face it. And as they stepped into the cool night air, Evelyn felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Whatever awaited her at the house, whether more secrets, more pain, or the closure she had sought for so long, she was ready. Because the music had taught her something she would carry with her forever, that even the most fractured stories could find harmony, and that the bonds of love, though tested by time and circumstance, could never truly be broken.